Should those with mental health issues be permitted to own a firearm? Red flag laws are popular and it seems intuitive. Get the guns before someone snaps, right? But have you ever actually thought through how that might actually work? Or, as I'll try and argue this morning, how it doesn't work? All right. Good morning once again to everybody. You know, I want to welcome you to another morning episode of the Liberty Dad podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. If you're tuning in live, then I especially thank you for giving me your time so early. All right, so I want to apologize for last night. Kind of made a last minute decision that I was not going to stream last night. The Sunday nights are my LP Happenings series where I will go out and find what's going on in the Libertarian Party, and then I report it to you and just let you know what's going on. Hopefully, that gives you an idea of what you might want to do in your affiliate, whether it's the state or the local level, or maybe you can you can just support from afar and you can just be excited about some of the things that are going on. And so what was happening? My mother-in-law turned 80 yesterday, so we had a big party for her. And initially, I was thinking that I was going to be able to just do it all. I was, and so I had a lot of work Saturday. I had a bunch of work Friday, working on a property that we're trying to finish up and get sold. And then, uh, after all of that, and after getting ready and setting up the house and decorating and all that, I woke up on Sunday morning, went over, did a little bit more work on a property, and then I got back to the house, get ready to party, and I was like, "Man, I'm starting to feel it." I was feeling tired, and I was like, "I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to actually do this." So I made the call about 2 o'clock. I mean, we were mid party, and I was like, "Man, I'm pretty sure that I'm not going to be ready to do a show tonight at 7, right?" So I just kind of put out with a picture, and I said, "Hey, there's not going to be any podcast. Here's a picture of my mother-in-law and my son, getting ready to celebrate her 80th birthday." And then the party wound down about 5 p.m. and I think I fell asleep right about 7 o'clock. We started to kind of, party started winding down. People started leaving, and then I ended up getting tired, and we finished up a couple of things, and then I sat on the couch for a minute. And I was like, all right, the rest of this stuff can just wait for a few minutes. Sat on the couch, turned on a movie, fell asleep. So, probably would not have been very useful. So I apologize for that, but I will try to make sure that in the future I plan ahead so that there will always be a show. So that's going to be my new goal, is to make sure that there is always, always, always a show. And if I have to pre-record it, then I will. All right, moving on. So now that we've got that out of the way, I wanted today to talk about something that actually happened over the weekend. So in addition to all of that, we have a friend that comes out at least once a year for the Florida Georgia game. He's from Georgia. Yeah, okay. But he's from Georgia, so he comes. Him and his brother come down, and they visit us, and then they go to the Georgia game. So on, let's see, what was it? Friday. So they came out Friday night actually, and we went out. We had a couple drinks. We got back, and then me and my buddy started talking about politics. Now, it wasn't so bad. I mean, we weren't like sloshed or anything. Okay, just had a couple drinks, so we were a little on the loose side. And I am a libertarian, of course, and he is not. In fact, you may have heard me said or say before on the show that most of my friends tend to be something other than libertarian. I've got a couple of friends that are in that libertarian sphere, the liberty sphere, somewhat, um, but most of them are somewhere outside of it. So I've got friends that are, super duper Republican. Got friends that are super duper Democrat. And this particular friend happened to be much more on the progressive side. So we ended up talking about gun control and mental health, and we got into an argument about gun laws and mental health. And it got a little bit loud, actually, at one point. But don't worry, no worries. It was loud and passionate, but it was still friendly. And at one point, even my wife tried to intervene, and she was like, "Okay, so what you're saying is, and then what you're saying is," and her intervention was just insufficient to get us to dial it down. But again, it's okay. I have a standing rule that anybody I will discuss any topic with any person. And the only thing that I ask is that after we're done, we still need to be able to have a beer together or whatever, drink a glass of tea, doesn't matter. We need to be able to go out and have a drink together and still enjoy each other's company. And so what I try to do, I mean, keeping that in mind with my friends, is to be mindful of where my friends are and ask them to also be mindful. And I've actually had friends in the past. We get into it, we're arguing, we're debating, and I had one friend who's actually a little bit more close to me in terms of ideology than many of my other friends. But one friend, we were disagreeing on something, and we were disagreeing pretty strong. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he just is like, "This conversation needs to be done. I'm not feeling it no more." And I was like, "Okay." So we stopped, right? And then later he said, "I just felt like I was not able to be as objective as I normally was, and I was getting a little bit more emotional, so I just stopped it." I said, "Okay, cool. No worries. Not a problem." Right. And and sometimes I'll say, "Hey, look, maybe we're getting a little bit loud." So we try to keep it. I mean, it's okay to get loud and all that. But anyway, so let's talk about mental health. And we're not gonna talk like specific gun laws. I'm gonna talk more broadly, just to kind of overall. Because when people talk about mental health and they talk about guns, it typically happens to be after an event like such as up in Maine. And a lot of time people will say something that sounds very, very normal, right? I don't want a crazy person owning a gun. Okay. There's nothing wrong with that on its face. But the question is, what happens when what do we do to prevent that? Because like I don't want a lot of things in this world. And so then we have to start asking ourselves, like, well, maybe we need to put in a law in place. Maybe we need to expand the the so-called red flag laws. And they go by various terms, whatever, but we can just go with red flag here. And so I started making the argument, and this is kind of what got us kind of so loud, is I made the argument. I said, look, I don't think that it's a good idea to focus on the guns. We need to focus on the mental health. And I said, we have a mental health crisis in this country. We need to focus on that. And his argument back was like, no, we need to focus on the gun. So the argument is, and to be fair to my friend, the argument is if we get the gun from the crazy person, well, that crazy person won't have a gun to shoot people with. So it kind of makes sense in a way. However, you have to get that gun from the crazy person, which means you have to identify that crazy person to identify somebody who's at risk of becoming a mass shooter. You have to identify them early enough before they actually do it, which means you also have to identify them among the other people who are crazy. So now we're going to stop using the word crazy and we're going to substitute it for a more appropriate word. And we're going to call it people with mental health issues. So now what we want to do is we want to identify the person who has a mental health issue. who is at risk of becoming a mass shooter who happens to own a gun. And we want to find that person and separate them from all the people who have mental health issues who do not own a firearm or, more importantly, are not at risk of shooting somebody. Okay. So that's where I think the problem is. And so I'm going to try to help you visualize it on this show. And so see if we can't create this argument with some visualizations. However, before we do that, let's look at some data here. So let's go to some mental health stats. So right up on the screen there. Okay. So according to SAM as HSA, that would be the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Any mental illness, AMI, is defined as having a diagnosable mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder other than a developmental or substance use disorder. Okay. So there is kind of a broad statement here, but what it's saying is like you've been diagnosed and you have mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. So it's like something out of the ordinary, something, and presumably something that is correctable, but it is something that is out of the ordinary, what we might call not normal. Okay. So and it's diagnosable. Okay. So we have to know about it. And so AMI can be in three categories. They can be mild, moderate, or serious. So I mean, it's pretty simple. And so now we have like this general definition of like mental illness. Okay. It's diagnosable. In other words, we can define it. We can put a label on it. We have criteria for that label, and it falls within the mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. All right. So let's move on to my next slide here that I've got. So there we go. All right. So mental health stats 19.86 people, adults. This is adults in the United States experience mental illness. And again, this is from the same resource. 4.91% experience severe mental illness, and then 4.58% report serious thoughts of suicide. Now, all of these numbers are distinct from each other, so they're part of the whole. Like these are the number of adults. Okay, so we're not saying like 19 or say 20% of the American population of the adult American population experience mental illness, and then out of that 20%, 4.9. No, it's 4.9% of all the adults, and also 4.58% of all adults report serious thoughts of suicide. So these are all independent of each other, not they're not coming from within one another. Okay. So that's our mental health stats. And then let's take a look real quick at some gun ownership. That's what we're kind of looking at. So, gun ownership of the adults surveyed by the Pew Research Center, and this was done in 2023, just recently. It was also done in 2021 and 2017. And the numbers do not vary much. Okay. Now, there's slight variance, but for the most part, these numbers are consistent. So, for the 2023 numbers, 32% of American adults own a firearm, and 10% live with a gun owner. In other words, they don't own the gun themselves, but they live with somebody who is a gun owner, which means 42% of the American adult population have access to a firearm in some way, right? Now, when I say access, when I say any of these things, we're just thinking kind of generically here. Okay. So I get it. There might be somebody who is an adult that lives in a house and all the guns are locked up, and that particular adult doesn't own any firearms, nor do they have access, like direct access to the firearms. We're not really getting into all those nitty gritty details. What we're just simply saying is 32% of all adults in the United States own a firearm, and 10% of all the adults who 10% of all the adults uh, do not own a firearm, but they live with somebody who does own a firearm. So in other words, there are 42% of the people that live in a home with a firearm. And we're going to make the assumption that all of them have some level of access to that firearm. Okay, so it's 42%. So now we want to take a look and we want to say, well, what does that actually end up looking like in terms of uh, people, like a graphical representation? Because I think this is where we start to look at and we can understand how my argument works. So let's take a look. And Here we are. All right. Making sure we got everything on the screen. Perfect. All right. So now we have 100 people here. Each one of these little pawns here represents a person, and they're all green, right? Yeah. Look good. All right. So we have 100 people here. Now, remember, we said about 20% of the population. And this represents 100 adults. Okay. So we're just taking like a little sample. We've got 100 adults here pictured up on the screen for anybody that might be listening to this podcast later. Um, and then what we're going to do is, and they're all green. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take a look and say, all right, well, let's graphically represent the 20% of people who have a mental health issue. So let's see what that looks like. All right. So now we have the 20% at the bottom in red. Okay. So these are the people that have any mental illness, and we're not discriminating against any particular type of mental illness. All we're simply doing is saying, do you have a mental illness as defined that is diagnosable, that falls in one of those three categories? And again, those three categories, let me take a look back at my notes here and I will remind you again. Let's see where'd they go here. Let's see. There it is. Okay. So those three categories were mental, behavioral, or emotional. Now, we probably can all agree that of those three, not all of those are necessarily equally split. So you have this 20% of the American adult population that has one of these three, and also one of these three levels: mild, moderate, or serious. And we're not breaking it down to, I only have so much time, folks. So we're not breaking it down. So we're just kind of being very generic here. Okay. So this is the mental illness that we have that we can just kind of identify. Okay. And that'll, the idea of making it more general like this rather than breaking it down very, very specifically, I think that's going to make a little bit more sense in just a moment. So, but let's continue on. And now the next thing that we want to look at is we want to say, okay, well, how many people in this 100 sample would statistically have a mental health issue, and then look at gun ownership? So we're going to look at the most unlikely case here. So this is the most unlikely case, and the unlikely case here is at the very top. You see that 40% of all the adults in this sample of 100, so 40 people, happen to have or happen to be black. Okay, so I got black pawns here. They represent people who live in a home where there is a firearm. Then you have the green section here, another 40%. These are people that do not live in a home or own a firearm or have a mental illness. And then at the very bottom, you have the 20% of the 100. Again, because we're doing a 100 sample, the 20% happen to have a mental health issue in one of those three types at one of those three levels that we described a moment ago. Now, the most unlikely scenario is the one that you're looking at, where none of the gun owners overlap with any of those with mental health issues. But we know that's not true because we have seen people who own guns in the news, and then it has turned out that they do have a mental health condition. So we know this is not true. So we have to kind of correct for this because we want to try to get a proper visualization so that we can understand the argument. So we're going to move on to the next most unlikely. The next most unlikely, as you can see, is that I've moved all of the 20% of people with mental health issues into and overlapping with the gun, with the gun ownership. So again, we went from, and if you look at it again here, so we go from 40% at top. So we got four rows of 10 people at top, on the top, who own guns. And if we shift all of the, all of the people that have mental health issues, 20%, that's the known ones. We'll get to that in a moment. If we shift them all up, then you have a combination of 40% of the population owns a uh, owns a gun, with half of them being people that have a mental health issue. Now we know this is also unlikely because this is the opposite end of the spectrum of the very first one, where they were completely distinct. Where'd they go here? There it goes. So it's the opposite end of this, right? So it's extremely unlikely, and we know it to not be true, that the groups are entirely separate. But it's also unlikely that everybody that happens to have a mental health issue is also somebody that lives in a home where there's a firearm. So that is also unlikely. So we need to look at a more likely situation. So then we look and we've split this visualization up to here. And so now what I've done is, for the purposes of this argument, is I've split the mental health group into half. So half of them are within the 60% of the population that does not have a firearm in the house. And then half of them are in the 40% of the people that have a firearm in the house. Okay, so now we've split these two up. Now, when I say more likely compared to what I just showed you, not necessarily more likely than any other situation. And the reason for that is because finding out the exact numbers would be extremely difficult. And I didn't have the time to dig in and try to even come close to figuring it out. So what I did was I just said, look, let's just make a 50-50 split for the representation. So in reality, that 40%, so these 40 people could be broke up in any number. It could be like 20. These 20 people with mental health issues, the 20%, it could be like 5% happen to be in a home with a gun, whereas the other 15 percent do not. It could be some variant thereof. So I don't really know exactly how many. But we know it's not all of them, and we know it's not none of them. So we're gonna kind of split it down the middle and call it even on that. However, now we also want to consider the folks that would be likely to commit suicide. So again, that was about 5%, and I couldn't split that evenly, so I just split it with 3 percent being those who happen to be in a home with a firearm, and then the other 2% in homes that do not have a firearm. So now we're kind of splitting this up so that we can visually represent where society might actually be. Okay. And this is part of my argument, because one of the things that I was telling my friend, okay, was you don't know who is going to be that person that might snap. And as we can see here, if we're looking at just this generic assumption that I've made about the data, we can see that out of 100 people, you have 40 people who neither have mental illness nor have a gun in their home. Okay. And those people might be the ones that say, well, we want laws to stop, somebody from, basically was that I don't want a crazy person owning a gun. But the problem is crazy person, and that's going to be our standard conversation that we have through, with one of our friends. I mean, that's not how the mental health issues, that's not how academics, they're probably going to use more formal terms. But when you were talking with friends, they're going to say something more like, I don't want a crazy person owning a gun. And it's not necessarily a bad notion. However, the question is, how do we get to that? And is that a bad path? And I would say it is. And when we look at this visualization here, we can see that there might be 3 people who, out of 40, who happen to be have suicidal thoughts. You have 10 people who have mental health issues, and then you have, and these are part of the 40 people who happen to have guns in the home. The problem is, and I didn't represent this on the graph, we don't know out of those 10 which ones might be willing to go and kill somebody. So we have no idea. So the only way would be to try and figure that information out, which sounds intuitive. It sounds like, hey, well, of course, that's what we should do. We should have more questions. We should, like when we should have more limitations on buying guns. We should put more waiting periods. We should, have this database that has this information, so on and so forth. However, here's the problem. Again, while you might have had a suicidal thought, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you are going to take somebody else with you. That's part of the problem. There's always going to be information that is unknown to you. And if you remember from some of these stories where there have been a shooter, there's been somebody that went on and killed somebody. A lot of them were they were already known to authorities. So authorities already had some awareness and yet nothing happened, right? Like they were aware, like, oh, we've been told this person is a threat. We've been told this person might do something. But then in many cases, it's also the case, it also is the case that some of these people have not been known. People will say, wow, I never knew so and so was this person. This is especially true for, like, say, serial killers and people that there are many people out there that live completely normal lives, and then we find out, oh my God, they're a crazy serial killer. Or, oh my God, they've been doing this very terrible thing behind the scenes, but they've been hiding it. So it's not the case that you can always know this information. Now you might say, well, we just need to get that information. Well, that's a big question on how are we going to get that information? We don't have it now. I wasn't, even just for the purposes of this show, I wasn't able to easily go up and say, all right, how can I break up these people into how society might actually look like? Like that, like finding that information was extremely difficult. And so I had to kind of make some assumptions here. So I'm making the assumption that there's a 50-50 split of those with mental health issues that reside in a home with a gun and those that do not, that reside in a home without a gun. That's an assumption on my part for this visualization. It's also assumption on my part that that uh, of the 5% of people who have had suicidal thoughts, 3 of them reside in a home with a firearm, whereas 2 of them do not. It could be that all 5 of them do, right? That could be the representation statistically, or it could be that 1 does and the other 4 are in homes without a gun. This is part of the problem. The problem is we don't have this information. What many of the laws end up doing is they try to acquire that information from the person. But that's part of the problem. Who admits to that? And this was part of my argument that I made to my friend. I said, we have a stigma against mental health in this country. And that stigma is, it is considered bad, like something that you did to have mental health. And it's it's not like one of the things that I compared it to. I said, imagine, and I was telling my friend, I said, imagine that it's something like breast cancer. I said, if a woman feels a lump on her breast, she has no qualms going into the doctor and saying, hey, will you check this out? I have this lump. Maybe it's something, maybe it's not. And I said, and nobody looks down upon a woman for getting that checked. We never think negative of it. It's always a positive thing. And one of the ways that you can tell this is there are many organizations dedicated to helping women identify breast cancer early, so that they can so that they either become breast cancer survivors, or they don't even have to call themselves a survivor because maybe they got it treated so early they were never in any danger, right? Like that's the goal. The goal is to catch these things as early as possible. And you may have remembered, you may remember that years ago there was a additional push for men for prostate cancer, right? It was a similar thing, like, hey, go and get yourself checked, so on and so on and so forth. And so the idea is that when we start looking at other health conditions, people are less stigmatized for having them. Nobody says, "Oh, there must be some problem with you that you got cancer." And we might not say that directly about mental health, but that's how we act. Now, the other problem here is that we have 20% of the people who have mental health issue. Now, the question is, where does that reside? And if we go back to our slide that we had over here, so let's go back over to let's do it this way here. Let's see here. There we go. All right, so we go back here and we see that your mental health issue can be in the mental, behavioral, or emotional, right? So this is a mental illness. It can be in one of those 3 categories. It can also be mild, moderate, or serious. Now, we can make a fair assumption since we don't have the specific data and we don't have it, the information necessary to say this, we can make an assumption that serious is the category where somebody is at risk of harming other people because of their mental illness. Well, here's the question: to what degree does that serious represent and let me see if I can bring it up here. What degree does that represent here? Right. So we've got 10 people that are in a home that has a firearm, and what degree of seriousness people that might want to harm somebody else fall within this 40%. But then we have to realize there's another hidden assumption here. And that assumption is that all of those people that would harm somebody would be somebody that would be of the caliber that would harm somebody with a gun. In other words, not there are a lot of variables here. So trying to catch my thought on that. There are a lot of variables on how this can play out, how this actually looks in society. Because again, remember, what I did here is I made a bunch of assumptions. And the further you dig in, the more you realize there's quite a few assumptions. And those assumptions go into when we craft our laws because we don't have this information. When you say, well, just add another question to the questionnaire that they have to fill out before they can purchase a firearm, what should that question be to get you the right answer? That's part of the problem. Another part of the problem, if we look back over here at these slides, let's see, I think it was, let's look back over here and then we'll go back to the slide here and we will go to this one right here. So it says 19.86 are experiencing or have experienced mental illness. And then if we look back initially, we can see that mental illness was defined as a diagnosable mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder. So another assumption in this is that that 19%, that 20% is accurate. It could be that it's actually 25%, which means if we go back over to our little people graph here, we look at the people graph, we have 40% of the population in green. These are the people that have no guns in their home, no mental illness. But if we're only counting what we've diagnosed, what we know for a fact, then that means there could be people that are in this green that are undiagnosed. It also means that in the top 40, where all the guns are, that could be that there's more people that would be in red. So again, you're crafting all these laws on a lot of assumptions, assumptions that we don't have the answers for. So therefore, you would be aiming to try to remove guns from homes in the goal that the crazy person, if you will, the person that has the mental health disorder, who might be at risk of harming another person, won't be able to because they don't have a gun at their disposal. However, here's the big problem: you're not addressing the root. And there's a reason we're at 20% of the population that has mental health disorders. Now, what is that reason? I don't know. But it's 20% of the population is a huge percentage, in my opinion, because I would think that would we would think I would think that it would be much less, somewhere closer to like under 10%. But it's 20% of the population has been diagnosed at some point. Now, the diagnosis doesn't have to be consistent, right? Like they could say 20% in 1 year, and it could be that 1 year you're diagnosed with some issue, and then the next year, maybe it's resolved, for whatever reason. Or, yeah, maybe it gets re-diagnosed, whatever the case may be. Like if you have bipolar, then it's likely that you're just going to have bipolar for the rest of your life. Like I don't know of any situation where somebody was diagnosed with bipolar and then later they were given a clean bill of health. Now it could be that you were misdiagnosed, which is yet another factor to consider because many people have stories where they have been misdiagnosed, including yours truly. So let's talk about that real quick. Let me tell you my story when it comes to, and I actually can tell you a story from myself and from my mother. So, story for me years ago, and this is like in my 20s, like I'm probably like 25, and I'm 45 now. So, we're talking like 20 years ago. I went to the doctor and I said, "Hey, I'm having some heartburn. I don't know what's going on here, but I've got this heartburn going on, and can we resolve it?" Doctor said, "Sure thing." So they gave me some pills, right? Some, whatever whatever pills that they were popular at the time. I think it was the purple pill. And so I would take the pill, and I still wasn't getting a resolution with my heartburn. I'd go back, say, "Hey, still having this heartburn issue. Can you figure out something else?" Okay, let's try this. So I try something else. And this repeats a couple of times. And I go back, and now I'm starting to get nervous. I'm like, hey, maybe you're missing something that's really, really important here. And, so I start expressing this nervousness. And so then they started saying, well, seems like you have general anxiety disorder. And I said, well, my anxiety is related to the fact that I came in and I initially was not anxious, but now I am because you don't seem to be getting anywhere with resolving my heartburn. So it's making me wonder if there's a serious underlying issue that you are missing. And they're like, no, 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 that's your anxiety. So they said here. So they asked me to take Paxil. I believe it was Paxil. I'd actually was given several medications at different times, but we'll go with just the one just to make the story more simple. So I was given Paxil, and I was told to take it twice a day. The problem was once I would take it, within about 45 minutes, I became extremely lethargic. Like I would literally just like lay my head down on my keyboard and just like lay there like, "Ugh," and I was like very useless. And I did not like this. And I was trying to take it, you would try to take it like maybe in the morning, like 9, 10 o'clock, and then take it again, like around like maybe 5 or 6, somewhere around there. Spread it out a little bit. And each time I would take it, I would just be so lethargic and like sleepy that I was totally useless and I didn't like it. And there were times where it was a really big problem, like if I'm just trying to drive. So I was like, all right, let's try to be more strategic about when I take this. So then I started taking it at noon or right before noon so that it would cut into my lunchtime. So I figure, hey, you know what? The boss doesn't care if I'm lethargic during lunch. So no biggie. And then I'll bounce back about the time that I need to go back to work. All right. And then I would take one right before I went to bed because I was like, all right, well, I'm going to be sleeping anyway. So I might as well be lethargic while I'm sleeping. Sure. So the goal here was one, to have my anxiety resolved. And then number two, as I was kind of messing around trying to adjust when I would take my medication, um, give me enough time to get used to the medication because the doctor said, like, hey, this will go away after like a week or two. And I was like, okay, cool. So after about a week or two, it wasn't going away. And I was like, I'm still also not dealing with this anxious. Like I'm still having heartburn. I'm still anxious. So it's not working. So I stopped taking it abruptly. Nobody told me this is a very, very bad idea. When I stopped taking it, all of a sudden, whatever anxiety that I had skyrocketed beyond belief. It was insane. It was the most difficult mental time that I can think of in my entire life. It was bizarre. I would forget standard words. Like literally, it's not a joke. I'm not making this up. I came home with my ex-wife. I think we were coming home from church, and I was trying to tell her about a dog or our dog or something, and I could not remember the word dog. Now it's common that people will forget something like birthday or a date that, some event happened, somebody's name. Those are normal things to forget. Like, so nobody really gets too worried about that. But when you forget the word dog and like you're in your mind, you can see the dog, you know what you want to talk about, but you can't think of the word dog. That is scary. And it really flipped me out. So now my anxiety is just all over the place, going in all different directions. It's insane. And then I also had really bizarre thoughts that I to this day I refuse to tell anybody about because they were just so bizarre. And I was like, who is this person that is thinking these crazy, wild thoughts? This is intense. Um, so I went back to the doctor and I'm like, all right, here's what happened. He gave me the medication. The medication wasn't working, but after a couple of weeks, I decided to stop taking it. And then everything just went crazy. My world is flipped upside down. I barely know which way is up. What in the world is going on? So they said, okay, we're going to give you Cymbalta. And I was like, okay, that's another medication for the head, basically mental health. I think it's for depression, but also for anxiety as well. And so they're like, "All right, we're gonna give you Cymbalta, and that should help you out." And so I asked them before I it was before I left, before I took it. I said, "All right, what's the plan?" They said, "Well, you're on Cymbalta." And I said, "Okay, but you don't understand. What is the plan here?" Because remember, folks, I came in for an issue related to heartburn. Like, I didn't come in for anxiety. I didn't come in because I was having weird thoughts. This happened after the fact. So now I'm given Cymbalta, and they're like, "You take 1 pill every day, and it'll take about 2 weeks for it to really get into your system and really, really activate." I was like, "Okay." But they also had no plan. Their plan, literally what they told me was, "You're on Cymbalta for now." And I was like, "For now?" Like, I don't even know what this means. So, I had to get myself level. So I got myself leveled out. Took 1 pill every single day. Then I decided, since it takes about 2 weeks for it to go through your system, to kinda level out in your system, I said, "That's gonna be my weaning plan." So I weaned myself off of it. So what I did was I skipped a day for 2 weeks, and then after 2 weeks, I skipped 2 days, and then after 2 weeks, I skipped 3 days, and I think I got to somewhere where I was skipping, like, 5 or 6 days, in between, and then somewhere around the 5, 6, maybe even 7-day range, that's when um, the uh, the pills that I happened to have at the time, that's when they were about gone anyway. And so I said, "All right, well, let's give it a shot and just go. We'll be done with them." And I was done with them, and it actually worked out, and it worked great. Now, here's the fun part: when I would skip a day, right about the time that I needed to take that next pill, I started feeling the wonkiness in my head. Like, it was I could start feeling it. And then when I started skipping 2 days, same thing. Like, about 24 hours roughly, I would start feeling that wonkiness, in my head. And it's hard to describe exactly, especially since it was 20 years ago. So now I'm leveled out. I'm back to standard heartburn, but I still got some anxiety because I'm like, what if you're missing something? So now I'm back to this level, and I'm like, all right, I made this vow to myself. I said, I will never take medicine for the head for things that you can't measure, right? Like, this is now, it's not that I'm opposed to them. I think there are people that have legitimate needs. But I think what happened in my particular case was that I got misdiagnosed. And years later, I was talking to a doctor, and I let him know this story, and he said, "Yeah, they did that wrong." He said, "You should have never been put on Paxil." He said, "That was a terrible that was bad practice." So I had at least one doctor agree with me that this should have never happened. But think about this, folks. Think about what happened to me. Like, I got put on medication. I went in for heartburn, and I ended up getting put on pills that I didn't need, that actually put me in a mental state that that's the only time that I've been in that mental state where I was extremely anxious because I'm forgetting words, I'm having weird thoughts. Okay, so this is a problem. Now, I'm not the only one that's experienced this. Apparently, it seems to run in the family. My mother, when I was a teenager, and my younger brother and my younger sister we were all in school. And the way that we were in school was, I went to high school, one of them went to middle school, one of them went to elementary school, and all the schools in the area happened to be separate buildings. So we are all in different buildings in different locations at our respective schools. So one day, my dad comes and he picks us all up. He takes us all home. We're like, in the middle of the day, we're like, what's going on here? We get home. My mom is sobbing. She is tears, talking about how she's been a bad mother and all this, and we're like, "What in the world is going on?" We had no idea. We had no clue what was going on. My mom is, like, having this, like, you know, like, depressive breakdown. Well, it turns out, I found this out years later, that, I don't know why my mom went in and was talking to the doctor, but she went in and she's talking, and she was diagnosed at that time with manic depressive disorder, which is now what they call bipolar. Okay, but that back then they called it was basically like, you can be depressed one day and you can be mania the other day. Now, personally, I don't remember my mother ever experiencing that degree of separation, like mania or depression. In fact, I she was always a go-getter, but I never remember her being somebody who fell into depression of any kind. Now, again, I'm a teenager, so maybe I just missed it. But to my knowledge, This never happened. So then, somewhere around that same time frame, my mom gets some medication, and I believe they gave her lithium, but I can't remember. But I believe that's the one. And she was taking that, and then she started seeing things coming. Like we had a marble table, a marble coffee table in the house. It was a white marble coffee table, and she would frequently take naps on the couch, and then with with the marble coffee table right in front. And apparently, she woke up and she started seeing like things coming out of the marble table at her. So she was like hallucinating. So my dad was like, "Nope, we're done with this," and he tosses that medication out. Um, my mom, as far as I know, those situations were the only times that she did anything that I noticed as a kid growing up that was out of the ordinary. The times that she was on medication. So why am I telling you these stories? Well, in addition, let's go back to our graphic here. In addition to this representation of 100 people, which represents the population. And remember, if you're just tuning in, this representation is the top four rows um, represent homes that have a gun. So this would be 40% of all adults in the United States live in a home where there is a gun present. 30%. So the first three rows would be the people who have the actual ownership. And that last row, that fourth row there is going to be people that do not necessarily have ownership. Okay. So that's the breakdown of these four rows. Then in that fourth row, I'm representing um, half of the people that have diagnosable mental health issues. Again, all adults. And then those first three represent part of roughly half of the 5% of people who have contemplated suicide. But what we haven't discussed, and I'm now telling you through these stories, is that some of those people who have been diagnosed have been misdiagnosed. So this is yet more information that we do not have. When you do not have this kind of information, you cannot make a law because your law will be based on poor information, which means some people will not some people will not be addressed by the gun law. That's the issue with these red flag laws. That's one of the there's multiple issues. The other issue is that when you put in these laws into place, a lot of the laws tend to be more restrictive. That means is it makes it more difficult for people to own a firearm. Those laws are applied to everyone. So this entire group here, this entire 100 people, they will all feel the effect of that law. So the people who already own firearms, if they want to purchase another firearm, they're going to have a more difficult time than they previously did, even though many of those people have no mental health issue, nor are they at risk for harming other people. But even more so, there's part of that group. We can see there's four rows of green here. Those are people that represent people that live in a home that has no known, again, known mental health disorder and no firearm. But they might want to purchase a firearm because when you look at the Pew data that I looked at, they said that there was a certain percentage. I don't remember. I think it was like 11% or something like that. But there was some percentage of people who do not own a firearm that would consider purchasing a firearm in the future. So now these gun laws are affecting all of those people as well, even though they don't have one. So it may seem like, oh, no big deal. But if they want to go and get one, now they are in a situation where they are going to have it more difficult. And the problem is we, one, haven't addressed the mental health issues. So we have all these laws now. So we add any number of different laws, any different restrictions upon gun ownership, and we're no guarantee that that these new laws are going to be applicable to the people that they need to apply to. But we do know they're going to apply to everyone. So now you're going to, in the attempt to try to stop, as we said earlier, I don't want a crazy person owning a gun. In the attempt to stop a crazy person from owning a gun, we are going to apply a law to most everyone that's more than likely going to affect them more than it will the quote unquote crazy person. Now, let's talk about that for a second. crazy person owning a gun. A lot of people have said that. I mean, you could probably go and search on Twitter and find a whole bunch of people who have said just that. Remember earlier when I said that mental health was stigmatized? That's what I'm talking about. What we want people not to shoot other people unless they're in danger, right? That's what we ultimately want. The best way to get that is to help people get themselves into a position where they don't want to. Because if I still want to harm somebody, but you have managed to take away my gun, I still have that desire to harm somebody. You haven't resolved that, which means I could use any other instrument, a rock, knife, car. There are many instruments that can be used to harm somebody else. We've seen instances that have nothing to do with guns where a person with mental health issues has harmed somebody else. Andrea Yates drowned her 5 children, did not use a firearm. She drowned them. There are other stories of mothers driving off a cliff, harming their babies in some other way. They don't use a gun, but they still qualify as the crazy person. This is part of the problem. This is why I think that when we want to resolve the issue of mentally unstable people harming other people, the answer cannot be we're going to put a gun law in place. Another reason, last and final reason, and I don't have good data to support this. So we're going to kind of have to think about things a little bit more in the abstract. We pass a law. What do people do? They go about their way. Wow. So assume we pass a law that says if you've ever been to a doctor to receive psychiatric care or had any kind of diagnosis or anything formal on paper, anything, then you can't have a gun. You have to give it up. And let's assume for a moment that it actually works, right? Like this is an assumption. The problem that we have with this is that number one, you're going to have people that are going to be unwilling to go to the doctor and get help. But number two, you're going to stigmatize further the idea that mental health should be treated, which goes back to the first point. People are going to be less likely to want to go and own up to it. Remember earlier, I was talking about how we approach the issue of breast cancer. We have foundations, we have marathons, we have all these things. They're good, they're positive things where we ask people, hey, if here's how you do a breast examination on yourself. Here's what to do. Go to your doctor if you feel a lump. Like we support people in a positive way. But then when it comes to mental health, we say, oh, crazy person. Oh, we should take your gun. These are a negative thing. But these have consequences because people are not robotic. People respond to incentives. If the incentive is that people are going to look at me negatively, there's no reason for me to go and get help. Why would I? Why would I subject myself to going and getting help just so somebody else will stop being negative to me? They're still going to be negative. I know that. And so this is the argument I think that we need to be having. We need to explain to people, and hopefully, I know that this was maybe a bit of a crude explanation here on my part, but hopefully, other people will watch this show, and then they will take this idea and they will repackage it so that it's explained even better. And my goal today was simply to explain my argument with some visualizations and with some data because at the end of the day, we need to have an understanding of what we're talking about. We need to make sure that if we are to support a law of any kind, that it's A, going to go toward helping solve the problem that we want to solve. And then B, it doesn't have what you might call, say, legal political collateral damage, right? What I'm saying is like, I am a person who has for 10 years had zero mental health issues. In fact, when I changed my diet, things radically changed. Like my heartburn started going down, anxiety started going down. Like I had a lot of benefits just by changing my diet. I went to the doctor, as I said earlier, and I got all kind of medication and that screwed me up and got me all crazy. And um, and all I needed was a simple dietary change. Now I can't say that's the same thing for everybody. There are people who do have serious mental health issues that are not necessarily going to be um, improved by simply just changing your diet. They might actually need medication, but we need to support them in the same way that we support people with other medical conditions. We need to have organizations for mental health. We need to have marathons and fundraisers, and we need to talk about it like, hey, if you're having a mental health issue, if you start hearing voices, we love you, we want you to get the help that you need, rather than the knee-jerk reaction of, oh my god, do you have a gun? Because when we look at those graphs, when we look at the data, one thing that we can determine is that since if the numbers are correct, if 20% of the population has some level of mental health issues, 20% of the population is not hauling off and harming other people. So the majority of them are not at risk of harming others. There are some, we need to figure out who those some are. But at the same time, we don't know who those people are. We don't know the right questions to ask. We don't know the right laws to pass. All we would be doing is satisfying this knee jerk reaction to say that somewhat but very poorly answers, I don't want a crazy person owning a gun. But since it poorly answers it, quote, a crazy person will still own a gun, or they will still be crazy. But again, we would prefer now to call it meant to have severe mental health issues. And if they have severe mental health issues, they could harm people in other ways. So we haven't addressed that problem. We haven't addressed the Andrea Yates of the mental health of those with mental health issues. We haven't addressed the people that will drive over a cliff with their children in the car, or drown their children, or stab somebody, or any of the other number of ways which people can harm another person. We haven't addressed those. And so, in my opinion, we would be doing a disservice to society as a whole simply by saying, well, we need to pass this legislation because this legislation is going to help. Because what it's really going to do is it's going to make people feel good at night, knowing that they passed legislation, shove off the responsibility to somebody else, and then cry about it later when something bad happens. Why? Because once they pass the legislation, well, then I'm done, right? We've solved the problem. We passed new legislation. Now the crazy person can't own a gun. So guess what? I can go on about my way, but you haven't solved the problem. All you've done is swept it under the rug. And one day that rug's going to be lifted and you're not going to like the outcome. All right. So that's my show for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. Let's see if there's is there any comments in here. All right. Let's let's address the comment or two. So let's see what we got here. To make it more complicated, I'm just going to throw it up on the screen and read it. To make it more complicated, those groups are not mutually exclusive. For example, bipolar going through divorce. Absolutely. So if we sat down and we just started a list of all the complicating factors that are going to make it difficult for us to identify who would be the person that we would want to take their gun away. Now, I know libertarians are like, dude, I don't even want to talk about it. We have to talk about it. We have to have that conversation. We have to pragmatically show people why it's a terrible idea. We can't just say, hey, it's their property. You can't take it. We need a better answer than that. That's what this episode is for, to give that better answer. And there are many complicating factors, which I believe we can all sit down and look at just by taking, a little bit of time to look at what we do know and then start recognizing what we don't know. And then once we start putting all that together in the same pile, we can look at it and say, we've got to do something different. Because at the end of the day, mental health does need to be addressed. And it's really sad that we right now look at 20% of the population is having a mental health issue. That number needs to go way, way down. We need to address that. And I believe that when we address that, one, we'll have a better society anyway. And then number two, you will start to see fewer and fewer of these horrible, tragic events such as mass shootings. All right. So that's my comments for today. Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to catch me every morning, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And then again, Sundays at 7 p.m. with my host, Susan Hogarth. We're going to look across the vastness of tyranny that's in this country, and we're going to find out what's going on in the Libertarian Party. And we're going to bring that information to you. Hopefully, it will inspire you to do some of the same things in your own community, or just give you the feel goods, knowing that other people are out there doing a lot of great work. Hopefully, it will do both. Be sure to do all the proper audience actions. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Where is that? We meaning me, because that's how big my team is. It's me. We are on Rumble and on YouTube. I am steadily working on improving the look and the feel of Rumble and getting all those things taken care of. But I am there. I am actually now streaming. So you can watch me on YouTube at youtube.libertydad.com. You can also go to rumble.libertydad.com. You can watch the shows there. Whichever one you prefer, go ahead and follow me there. Leave me a comment. I do try to read the comments even after the fact. Ring the bell, like the videos, spread the word out. If you want a clip of something in my video that you thought I said well, go ahead, do that. Tag me on social media. Speaking of social media, you can find me, Liberty Dad, on Facebook, or Liberty Dad Pod on Twitter, now known as X. Or you can just go old school, send me an email, libertydadpodcast@gmail.com, because I would absolutely love to hear from you. And remember, folks, your business, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people and your product is liberty. Want to catch you tomorrow, but for now, we are out.